We should talk about OpTic Texas because we talked about them yesterday, and we don't necessarily want to double up, but I think considering OpTic is the most popular team in the league, and there's been so much anticipation or maybe a desire from the Green Wall for this roster change to happen, I think it should be noted at the top. Shotzzy was on his stream today, and he was asked a bunch of questions, obviously, about what's going to happen with the OpTic Texas roster. We even discussed yesterday about how Mercules might be a potential target for OpTic going into the Major Four qualifiers, which of course start later this week. So there's not a traditional break in between the Major and the qualifiers. But Shotzzy said that we're not switching. That was his exact quote. And I don't know. I'm inclined to believe him. I don't think like that's something that he would necessarily lie about, but also it is a sticky situation because he's in a position where if he says if he doesn't say anything, if he declines to even answer that question, then there is speculation that it's going to happen. Obviously, if he says it's not going to happen, there's going to be backlash, which there has been from the OpTic Texas fans about, obviously this team is in 8th place in the CDL standings, very much in danger of not even making it to champs after winning champs a year ago. What do you make of all of this? Shotzzy saying, "Hey, we're not going to switch up our roster now."
Yeah, I think Benjay Nassim had probably the most logical reaction to this clip. It is worth mentioning, I just based on like the tone of Shotzi's voice and everything in this clip. I mean, it's only like a 10-second clip, so it's hard to really gather any information from that limited amount of time there that the clip is running. But it doesn't seem like he's joking. It seems like he's probably like a little annoyed that his chat most likely right as he's going live for the first time after the tournament is probably flooded with questions and all that. And he's probably just like, just wants to address it, get it done and over with, and move on. But Benjay did point out, he retweeted Crone's tweet of the Shotzi clip and said, one, plenty of pros have lied, spread misinfo on social Twitch about changes to not tip their hand for what it's worth. Two, T8 in back-to-back events and sticking, if happening, is not going to be a popular decision. It's actually back-to-back-to-back events, top 8.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that's like,
Way up.
it wouldn't surprise me if something comes out over these next couple of days where OpTic does decide to make a change, because that's just been like the guessing game with OpTic this year, at least from my perspective, is I really thought they were going to stick even when they were struggling during the Major 2 qualifiers with the champs winning roster from last year. I was off on that. I didn't think even before that, I didn't think after Major 1 they were going to go back to Pred in favor of Hook, when it looked like Hook was the best player on the team for that like little stint to start the year. So, and obviously they did go back to Pred. So that I've been off in reading the OpTic roster situation for most of this year. So I think whatever I'm gonna say, the opposite might very well happen, and that's what I'm feeling right now. That if Shotzzy says they are sticking, that I believe him. It felt like when the stuff came out about Kenny, like quote unquote stepping down and all that. They bring in Skies as like a vibes guy for the team. It felt like then that they were planning on using this roster for the rest of the year. Shotzi says here that they aren't making a change, so I'm inclined to believe him, but we will have to wait and see. Again, they play on Saturday, and said it yesterday. They don't technically have to make a change before that match on Saturday. They could make a mid qualifier change. I definitely disagree with that decision. I either think you make a change before these qualifiers or you just stick it out and ride it out with the current team. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. I do think the whole, like you said at the top of the show, we went into details yesterday about Mercules and all that, and gave a bunch of possible angles to what his situation is. Is he going to stick with Toronto as a sub? Is he going to stick in Toronto's roster and Bean's going to be moved to the bench just because of potential recurring visa issues if those can't be resolved? Or is Mercury's going to get an offer from another team? Felt like one of those other teams that he could potentially get an offer from would be OpTic, because it felt like, just based on what we saw from Mercury's this past event, he could fill in for Skies on this team and play that little flex role and do a good job at it, because we saw him do pretty well this past weekend with in a dire situation where he had limited practice, if no practice at that. So yeah, I mean, obviously, if OpTic decides to stick, they're what's the saying? They're making their own bed or making their own grave, and they got to lay in it, or whatever the saying is. Like that's going to be their decision. They got to deal with it if the rest of the way. If things don't improve. But like Ben J said at the end of this tweet, they've had 3 different rosters for the 3 majors, and each major has resulted in a top 8 finish. So the little tweaks to the roster haven't made a big change in terms of OpTic's placing yet, but who knows? I guess, looking at this literally a year ago, OpTic had a terrible placing in Major 4. I don't remember how they
I think
did in the Major 4 qualifiers.
I think they was it not that they lost like all but one of their qualifiers and then got double first rounded, I think.
Maybe. I mean, I know they did bad at the LAN. I just can't remember the qualifiers leading up to that. But regardless, they obviously responded to that by winning champs. So maybe that's the thought process here. Like you can't do worse than you did at the last major last year. And then you built off of that and went on to win champs. So we'll have to see how it works out for the Green Wall.
Yeah, so they went the Major 4 qualifiers last season. They tied for last place. They were 1-6. I think they lost like a bunch of game 5s, which was kind of like their thing at the time. And then I'm pretty sure they got double first rounded in Major 4, and then or I guess not double first rounded, just first rounded by Miami, and then they went on to win champs. So I mean. They probably can talk themselves into that, I guess, delude themselves that this is just, or, if we did it last year, we can do it this year. The difference is that you had Kenny last year, you had Pred last year. This team is not as talented as the one you had a year ago, and you haven't shown any kind of proof at all this season that this is a championship level roster other than the Major 1 qualifiers. That's the only time that this team has looked remotely competitive against the top teams. So I would just say, if they were to think that, and I don't necessarily think they are, I would just say that that's not the case. You guys are not anywhere close to where you were back in 2024. I think I made my case for why they should make the roster change yesterday. I'm not going to really repeat that, but I can understand the idea behind not making this change, especially when you already have the qualifiers coming up this weekend instead of next weekend. You think maybe you can get a little farther ahead with this current roster, just continuing to practice versus making this change and kind of starting from scratch or somewhere near scratch. But still, like, this team is really on the bubble, and this could be, this will be a make or break, right? Like, if they don't make this change and they don't make champs, I mean, Karma gets so much shit about it. Shotzzy, Dashy, those guys get it. Hex gets it. Maybe Scump even gets it. I don't know. Maybe get some residual hate. And Methods and Imbos, they all get the hate because OpTic did not make champs. And they're blamed for whatever reason. But yeah, this is a really bad situation that they're in. And I was just looking at their qualifier schedule. They have a real good shot of starting 0-3 in these qualifiers. And you were talking about how they could theoretically make a mid qualifier roster change. And I think if they do start 0-3, I could see that happening. Just the panic of, oh my God, like, especially if Minnesota wins like 2 of their first 3 matches, it really might come down to we need to just win 1 or 2 more matches this season, and we're not confident that this roster can do that. Obviously, that's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts, but certainly OpTic has not performed close enough to where you could have any sort of confidence that they could win even 2 matches. I don't think you can have a ton of confidence that they can win 2 of 5 qualifying matches. So they're in a really bad spot. I disagree with the decision if they're not going to make a change, but like Ben said, maybe it's just lying. Like maybe Shotzzy just got on there and was just like, I'm just going to say we're not making a change, and then we'll announce it on Thursday or Friday afternoon, and then people can kind of do with that what they will. But yeah, they're I have no idea. This OpTic season has been one for the history books. I was certainly not expecting that either. The next thing we want to talk about, I guess it's not a topic, but I just thought it was interesting, and it was something that I pointed out to you right after we got off stream last night, was that Breaking Point had kind of created their own version of the triangle that you specifically mentioned yesterday on the podcast, and you were talking about how FaZe has been able to beat LAT, and LAT has beaten Vancouver, Vancouver's beaten Atlanta FaZe, and Breaking Point put a rock, paper, scissors graphic on their social media, and LAT is 5-0 against Vancouver. Vancouver's 3-2 against FaZe, and FaZe is 3-1 against LAT. And I think that is a very good illustration of where we're at this point in the season. We have 3 teams above the rest, and then I would say there's Toronto, and then probably Carolina. Like, I don't know if they would necessarily be grouped together. Yeah, and then Miami probably. But then it seems like a pretty big gap between that. But, it definitely, we have a definitive top 3, where in the past, like you've mentioned, we had a top 4 or sometimes even a top 5, like where we felt like even the 5th place team could get up there. And I guess this season, if Carolina could ever beat LAT, then we could talk ourselves into that kind of idea. But we have 3 top teams, and they're all able to kind of beat one another at certain points. And I think that's going to be an interesting way to finish this season. So let's talk about FaZe, because that's probably the way to jump off this, unless you have anything else.
I was just going to say, based on as a general reminder, this isn't the biggest difference here is especially not even changing from last year to this year, where it's like a 4-team race to a 3-team race this year. But it's changed from the beginning of this season, because at the start of the season, it felt like it was the 3 teams were going to be FaZe, LAT, and OpTic.
Yeah, sure.
And it's just OpTic didn't live up to that regard yet, and obviously there have been a multitude of reasons as to why that has happened. But at this point, it is like, coming into the season, we thought it was going to be like a top 3 or a triangle as we have here. It's just Vancouver has replaced OpTic, and I think that goes back to our conversation last night of the immediate impact Neptune has had since joining the Vancouver roster. And I think we went pretty in depth with that last night, so not going to repeat it here. And if you guys want to hear us talk more about that, go back and listen to yesterday's episode 171.
Well, that's kind of like just roster changes in general. Like, some roster changes look kind of great on paper. Like bringing in Hook for OpTic was kind of a big win, obviously, because people are saying, "Oh, Hook's going to be really good. He's like one of the top players in this game." And OpTic brings him in, and he does have an immediate impact. They're able to, I think, sweep the rest of their qualifying matches. And they did look, I think they were the number 1 seed going into Major 1, and then it fell apart at Major 1, and then they made another roster change, and then it spiraled out of control at that point. Where Vancouver, they made one roster change. They made a definitive change. They stuck to it, and it has worked out perfectly for them. And they had other options, of course, at that time. We were talking about how they might, even Hook was potentially an option, because we didn't know what he was going to do, and obviously he waited out to go back to OpTic. But it all kind of worked out, and that's just kind of the funny thing about roster changes. They might not always look the best. Nobody thought that Neptune coming into this roster for Vancouver was going to be this game-changing change, but it turned out to be the best roster change in recent history. Like, I can't remember one that has had such a big impact like this, taking a bottom tier team to a top 3 team within, well, really within a few weeks, because they were already beating FaZe and kind of competing with LAT. So I can't remember a time that that's really happened. But yeah, I mean, roster changes are funny.